May 15th, 1994, 13-year-old Christina Marie Plante left her home in Star Valley, Arizona. It's a small town northeast of Phoenix. She was headed out on foot to a stable where her horse was kept, and that was the last time anyone saw her. Her disappearance was described as suspicious, and she was considered endangered. Missing person flyers flooded the area, describing Christina as having blue eyes and dark blonde hair, last seen wearing a white t-shirt, multicolored shorts, and black tennis shoes.
In 1994, a 13-year-old girl stepped out of her front door and vanished without a trace. For 32 years, the entire nation was convinced she had fallen victim to a brutal abduction. Police scoured every forest and distributed thousands of flyers, but to no avail. Then, in early 2026, the phone at the Major Crimes Unit suddenly rang. On the other end of the line, a calm woman's voice admitted,
"I'm hoping that you're my missing person."
There was no sinister predator. The most chilling twist of all is how this young girl managed to voluntarily erase her own existence for over 3 decades. What really happened? For exactly 32 years, the name Christina Marie Plante was synonymous with a parent's absolute worst nightmare. When a child vanishes without a trace, society instinctively conjures the most terrifying scenarios: the phantom predator in a passing vehicle, the faceless abductor lurking in the shadows of a quiet rural town, the grim and undeniable certainty of foul play. The narrative seemed written in stone. Millions of Americans who saw her face plastered across faded missing persons flyers and national crime databases were entirely convinced that the young 13-year-old from Star Valley, Arizona, was the tragic victim of a heinous crime. We believed she had been snatched against her will, violently dragged into the abyss by a monster. Helicopters chopped through the skies, canine units scarred the rugged terrain, and seasoned detectives chased down thousands of dead-end leads. But we were all wrong. The entire nation was thoroughly and spectacularly deceived. Let us lay our cards on the table and discard every gruesome theory immediately. There was no boogeyman. There was no violent struggle, no muffled screams in the woods, and absolutely no kidnapping. The shocking truth, finally uncovered by cold case investigators in early 2026, completely dismantled a 3-decade-old illusion. Christina was not taken. She orchestrated her own vanishing act, in a revelation that sent shockwaves through the very law enforcement agencies that had spent decades hunting for a phantom suspect. Police confirmed a bitter pill to swallow: the 13-year-old had simply executed the ultimate escape plan entirely on her own terms. The sheer audacity of her disappearance is best encapsulated in the surreal moment of discovery. When Captain Jamie Garrett of the Gila County Cold Case Unit finally tracked down the now 44-year-old woman who was living a quiet, unassuming life under an entirely new identity, the veteran investigator braced for a harrowing tale of captivity and survival. Instead, she was met with a jarringly nonchalant reality. Recalling the climactic, long-awaited phone conversation, Captain Garrett described her own utter disbelief.
Well, I guess she had the help of other family members that she must have had some type of communication with. I mean, because I had asked her that question. I'm like, well, how did you leave? And she's like, well, what do you mean? I walked out the front door. And I'm like, well, that's not what I meant.
Right.
I meant, how did you leave Arizona? So she was not willing to want to go there. She didn't really want to tell me the details.
6 simple words that instantly invalidated thousands of hours of police work, countless exhausted volunteer search parties, and millions of taxpayer dollars. But this admission does not neatly tie up the mystery. Rather, it cracks open a far more baffling psychological thriller. We are forced to confront an agonizingly perplexing reality. How does a 13-year-old girl possessing no money, no personal vehicle, and no sophisticated resources manage to pull off the scam of the century? How does a vulnerable adolescent outsmart seasoned homicide detectives, evade specialized canine tracking units, and completely bypass the national grid? To disappear is one thing, but to successfully ghost the entire United States justice system for an era longer than the lifespan of a whole generation requires a level of cunning that defies basic logic. The boogeyman didn't take Christina. So who was secretly waiting for her at the end of that driveway? To fully comprehend the sheer mastery of this vanishing act, one must travel back to the deceptively tranquil afternoon of Sunday, May 15, 1994. The setting was Star Valley, a quiet, tight-knit mountain community nestled in Gila County, Arizona, where the scent of pine lingered in the warm air and violent crime was virtually non-existent. It was around 12:30 p.m. when 13-year-old Christina stepped out onto the sun-baked dirt of Moonlight Drive. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a carefree teenager running a simple weekend errand. Dressed casually in a white t-shirt, striking multicolored shorts patterned in red, yellow, and blue, and black tennis shoes, she painted a vivid, innocent picture, one that would soon be permanently etched onto thousands of missing child posters across the state. With practiced ease, she told her family she was just taking a short, familiar walk down the road to visit a horse she cared for. It was a mundane routine that raised zero suspicions. She turned her back, walked down the driveway, and simply stepped out of existence. The timeline of her life effectively flatlined the moment she moved out of sight. There was no screeching of tires, no desperate cries for help echoing through the rural valley, and no frantic struggle disrupting the quiet afternoon. She walked into the thin Arizona air and evaporated. When she failed to return, the initial spark of concern rapidly escalated into a raging wildfire of panic. Within hours, the serene landscape of Star Valley was utterly transformed. The quiet rustle of the woods was violently replaced by the thrumming blades of police helicopters, the urgent shouting of hundreds of terrified community volunteers, and the frantic panting of tracking dogs pulling hard against their leashes. They tore through the dense brush, scored rugged drainage ditches, and grid-searched the vast, unforgiving wilderness, desperate to find even a single scrap of fabric or a misplaced footprint. Yet, as the days bled into agonizing weeks, a chilling and profoundly unsettling contrast began to emerge. On one side was the deafening chaos of a massive, multi-agency search operation. On the other was the pristine, almost mocking silence of the physical environment. There was not a single drop of blood, no scuff marks indicating a struggle, no discarded belongings, and no scent trail for the highly trained canines to follow. The crime scene was immaculately clean. In forensic terms, a scene this devoid of physical evidence usually points to a highly sophisticated predator who knows exactly how to sanitize their tracks. But as we now know, there was no predator. This was the work of a teenage runaway. However, pure logic dictates an inescapable truth. A 13-year-old child on foot, clad only in summer shorts, does not just walk out of a rural valley and vanish from the face of the earth without leaving a single trace. An impulsive runaway gets tired, gets hungry, or gets spotted. The flawless execution of this escape leaves no room for doubt. She didn't walk blindly into the wilderness. She walked purposefully into a waiting vehicle. The perfect charade in Star Valley was exactly that, a meticulously coordinated performance. Christina was the lead actress, but she was entirely incapable of directing this masterpiece of deception alone. Someone had to be waiting just out of sight. The chilling question that hung over the empty dirt road was undeniable. How did she evaporate without a trace, and who was the phantom accomplice standing in the shadows to catch her? The flawless execution of Christina's disappearance practically screamed of adult intervention. A 13-year-old girl does not simply wander down Moonlight Drive and spontaneously manifest a foolproof, untraceable getaway. The cold, hard truth that investigators finally unearthed decades later confirmed the lingering, unspoken suspicions. Christina did not act alone. She may have been the desperate architect of her own vanishing, but she absolutely required a loyal contractor to build her bridge out of Star Valley. The phantom waiting just out of sight on that quiet dirt road was not a predatory stranger, but rather the most dangerous and effective type of conspirator and insider. Authorities eventually confirmed that an undisclosed family member had secretly intervened, acting as the crucial, invisible linchpin in this grand deception. The logistics of her extraction were far too meticulously planned to be the impulsive whims of a runaway child. While terrified volunteers were frantically beating the bushes and tracking dogs were sniffing the rugged terrain of Gila County, Christina was already miles away, accelerating toward a completely new existence. A vital, chilling piece of the puzzle lay in a fleeting detail that slipped through the cracks in 1940. A vehicle belonging to a relative was reportedly spotted down in the sprawling metropolitan hub of the Phoenix airport around the time of her disappearance. This wasn't a spontaneous hitchhike, it was a highly calculated extraction. The airport signified a gateway, a definitive severing of ties, launching a young girl out of the isolated Arizona mountains and into the vast, untraceable anonymity of the American landscape. It provided the velocity and the distance required to completely outrun the immediate blast radius of a localized police search. But the physical logistics pale in comparison to the terrifying psychological endurance of the accomplice. This unseen relative didn't just drive a getaway car, they masterminded a 32-year lie of omission. Consider the sheer, almost sociopathic level of composure required to pull this off. This individual likely stood shoulder to shoulder with weeping neighbors. They watched the town meetings, saw the heartbreaking posters printed with Christina's smiling face, and observed the local law enforcement agencies exhaust their resources and manpower. They watched a community collectively traumatize itself over the supposed violent abduction of a child, fully aware that the victim was safe, secure, and successfully smuggled out of the state. They watched her legal guardian plunge into a living nightmare of unanswered questions. And through all of that agonizing public grief, the accomplice bit their tongue. For more than 3 decades, they swallowed the truth and maintained an impenetrable fortress of silence. Who was this shadowy figure? What profound familial fracture or desperate, misguided sense of loyalty could compel an adult to aid and abet a runaway minor, effectively becoming an accessory to a hoax that terrified a nation? To hold a secret of that magnitude as the years turn into decades requires an ironclad will. They watched the world search in the dark while they calmly held the only flashlight. Why did they do it? To answer that, investigators had to look past the mechanics of the escape and peer into the dark, fractured dynamics of the very home Christina was so desperate to leave behind. Every mastermind needs a motive. If the how of this staggering disappearance was answered by a phantom accomplice and a meticulously planned airport extraction, the why remained hidden within the quiet walls of her own home. When the terrifying illusion of a violent abduction was finally stripped away, investigators were left staring into the dark, hidden corners of a fractured family dynamic. Christina was not desperately sprinting away from the clutches of a monstrous stranger in the woods. She was actively, deliberately fleeing from the suffocating reality of her own life. The emotional architecture of Christina's world was built on a foundation of profound loss and legal obligation. Following the tragic death of her biological father, a court order had dictated her fate, placing her under the legal guardianship of her uncle, Gary Plante, and his wife. To the outside observers in the tight-knit community of Star Valley, it appeared to be a standard, perhaps even benevolent, familial intervention, a safety net for a grieving child. However, the emotional truth behind closed doors was entirely different. Authorities later confirmed a stark and deeply personal reality. The 13-year-old was intensely, inescapably unhappy with her living situation. She felt profoundly displaced, trapped in an environment devoid of the emotional warmth, understanding, and foundational love she so desperately craved. At 13, an adolescent possesses virtually no legal autonomy. They are tethered by the gavel of a family court judge and the rigid boundaries of adult decisions. For a young girl harboring a quiet, desperate misery, that house on Moonlight Drive likely felt less like a sanctuary and more like a psychological prison. It is vital to note that police ultimately found no evidence of physical violence or criminal misconduct within the home, making her departure all the more complex. She was not running from physical blows or undeniable horrors, she was running from a chronic, agonizing sense of alienation. To truly grasp the chilling depth of her desperation, one must examine the devastating collateral damage of her exit. A young girl's world is fiercely anchored by innocent attachments, and for Christina, that anchor was her beloved horse. In a life fraught with instability, that animal likely represented her only pure source of unconditional affection and unfiltered solace. Yet, she left it behind, walking away from the creature she cherished most, without leaving a note of instruction or a final goodbye. Was not a careless oversight, it was a brutal, cold-blooded emotional amputation. It was a calculated, heart-wrenching sacrifice that underscores the terrifying magnitude of her resolve. On that Sunday afternoon, she didn't just walk away from a rural street address, she ruthlessly executed the very concept of Christina Marie Plante. She shed her own identity as easily as a frayed, ill-fitting coat, at an age when most adolescents are merely beginning to figure out who they are. This 13-year-old made the devastating, absolute decision to become a ghost. She stared into the terrifying, vast abyss of a nameless, anonymous existence and decided it was vastly preferable to spending one more day in her own reality. The true tragedy of 1994 wasn't a violent kidnapping. It was the heartbreaking fact that a child felt her only path to salvation was to completely and permanently erase herself from the Fast forward to early 2026. The analog world that allowed a 13-year-old girl to effortlessly slip through the cracks no longer exists. In 1994, social media consisted of folded, handwritten notes passed secretly in middle school hallways. To vanish meant simply walking away and severing physical ties. There were no cell towers to ping, no omnipresent surveillance cameras tracking license plates, and no digital facial recognition software. The era of paper trails and payphones was a runaway's greatest accomplice. Chief Deputy Lahey of the Gila County Sheriff's Office summarized this stark generational divide perfectly, noting the sheer impossibility of pulling off such a stunt today. If some of the technologies we have today were in place back then, she probably would have never even gotten out of the Payson area before we would have located her. But back then, we didn't have that. In the 1990s, police were effectively searching for a needle in a haystack while wearing a blindfold. But by 2026, the blindfold was off, and the omniscient, inescapable gaze of the digital age was focused sharply on the past. Enter Captain Jamie Garrett, the tenacious head of the Criminal Investigations Bureau and its cold case unit. Armed with an arsenal of tools that would have seemed like pure science fiction 30 years prior, Garrett refused to let the file collect dust. Where tracking dogs and helicopters had failed, algorithms and digital footprints were destined to succeed. It is virtually impossible to live in the modern world without leaving a trace. A marriage license, a localized law enforcement database, a digital background check, every keystroke is a breadcrumb. Garrett meticulously fed the fractured details of Christina's old life into modern analytical systems, cross-referencing physical descriptions, estimated ages, and the quiet geographic movements of the undisclosed family member who had helped her escape. Slowly, the invisible ink began to reveal a clear, undeniable picture. The databases flagged a match: a woman living under a completely different name, a married adult who had successfully built a new life, a new family, and a new reality, entirely insulated from the tragic myth of Christina Marie Plante. The digital dragnet had finally closed in. The climax of this decades-long saga did not happen during a tense standoff in a dark forest. It happened in a brightly lit office with the push of a button. Captain Garrett dialed the number. Because of the sheer amount of time that had passed and the name change, Garrett wasn't entirely certain she had the right woman, forcing her to leave a tense, carefully worded voicemail. Then came the call back. As the phone rang on Garrett's desk, the agonizing mystery of 32 years hung in the balance. When the line connected, Garrett introduced herself, gently laying out the breadcrums.
This is what I have. I believe you're the missing person. Did you ever live in Arizona, specifically Star Valley?
Right.
And I started mentioning some of the details, and she basically confirmed on the phone that yes, I am her.
And what was the why?
The phantom who had haunted Gila County for a generation was finally forced to speak. With a few simple affirmations, the woman on the other end of the line confirmed her identity. Her impenetrable fortress of silence had crumbled. The ghost had finally been cornered, not by a physical barricade, but by the relentless, inescapable reach of time and technology. When a missing person is finally located after 3 agonizing decades, society instinctively anticipates a deeply emotional climax, a tearful reunion. a flood of cathartic explanations, and a desperate desire to bridge the immense gap of the lost years. But the 44-year-old woman on the other end of the line offered absolutely none of those things. She was no longer the vulnerable, unhappy 13-year-old girl from Star Valley. She was a grown woman who had spent her entire adult life fiercely protecting a fortress of her own making, and she had no intention of lowering the drawbridge for law enforcement. Having successfully confirmed her identity, Captain Garrett naturally attempted to uncover the hidden mechanics of the mystery. How exactly did she slip out of Arizona undetected? What were the specific, agonizing details of the home life that drove her to execute such a ruthless escape? Instead of a dramatic confession, Garrett hit an impenetrable emotional wall. The woman's response was staggeringly devoid of nostalgia, guilt, or any lingering need to justify her teenage actions to the authorities. Recalling the frustratingly brief exchange, Captain Garrett noted the stark, unyielding detachment in the woman's voice. When pressed for the hidden truths of 1994, the former runaway swiftly and cleanly shut the interrogation down.
She was not willing to want to go there. She didn't really want to tell me the details.
So she didn't even tell you what was the problem that made her want to leave?
The woman further emphasized that she now has her own family, her own adult reality, and the dramatic disappearance that captivated a nation is simply not something she even thinks about anymore. That was an old life. With those blunt, dismissive words, she casually swept away 32 years of nationwide panic, the relentless efforts of thousands of volunteer searchers, and the lingering questions of a community that had never stopped looking for her. Her demeanor was chilling in its absolute, unwavering decisiveness. There was no emotional breakdown, no plea for societal understanding, and absolutely no desire for a heartwarming familial reunion. She had not been waiting in the shadows to be rescued or forgiven. She had simply been interrupted. She made it abundantly clear that the desperate runaway from 1994 was effectively dead, buried beneath decades of carefully constructed normalcy. Today, she exists under a completely different name, anchored by a new family and a history she painstakingly wrote for herself. The life she built from the ashes of her childhood is the only reality she acknowledges. To her, the mystery that gripped the nation is not a tragedy demanding a neat resolution, but a closed chapter she outright refuses to reopen. The absolute finality in her voice delivered a profound message to the investigators: you may have solved the case on paper, but you do not own my story. She claimed her ultimate autonomy at 13, and at 44, she fiercely defended it, proving that sometimes, the most flawless escape is simply refusing to look back. In the sprawling, heavily documented annals of American true crime, the resolution of a decades-old missing person case almost universally follows one of two grim trajectories: the heartbreaking discovery of human remains, or the dramatic, long overdue arrest of a hardened predator. We are culturally conditioned to expect a villain. We demand the satisfying click of cold steel handcuffs, the solemn courtroom verdicts, and the definitive closure of a judge's gavel striking the block. Yet, the chilling saga of Christina Marie Plante defies every conventional expectation. This was a nationwide, 32-year manhunt that mobilized search helicopters, specialized canine units, and generations of cold case detectives, only to conclude without a single arrest warrant being issued. There will be no perp walks, no sensationalized trials, and no culprits brought to justice. The Gila County Sheriff's Office formally closed the massive file with a stark, unprecedented anticlimax. Ultimately, no crime was ever committed. The sheer uniqueness of this conclusion forces a profound reevaluation of the entire narrative. Law enforcement officers, driven by a sworn duty to protect and serve, spent a generation hunting for a victim who actively never wanted to be saved. From a legal and operational standpoint, the detectives achieved exactly what they set out to do. They successfully located the missing child and verified her safety. However, because she orchestrated her departure of her own volition, and is now a legally independent adult, the jurisdiction of the justice system effectively evaporates into thin air. Even the phantom relative, the unseen accomplice who masterminded her extraction and harbored a fugitive from a massive public search, faces no legal reckoning. The police, respecting the adult woman's privacy, and acknowledging the complete lack of actionable criminal exploitation, chose to permanently close the ledger. The case is resolved, but it is entirely devoid of the righteous retribution the public so desperately craves. This unsettling resolution pushes us into a gray, uncomfortable philosophical territory, blurring the rigid lines between protecting public safety and respecting a fundamental, albeit radical, human autonomy. It forces society to grapple with an incredibly provocative question: does an individual possess the intrinsic right to completely disappear? When millions of taxpayer dollars and thousands of volunteer hours are poured into a frantic rescue mission, does the public have a right to demand the truth, or does the victim have the ultimate right to slam the door in their faces? Christina's absolute refusal to cooperate serves as a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice is sometimes blinded by its own benevolent assumptions. We assumed she was in mortal danger, but the only thing she was truly in danger of was being dragged back into a life she utterly despised. Ultimately, the closure of this case is as fractured and imperfect as the human condition itself. The public must accept that there are dark, intricate secrets that will forever remain buried in the dusty, pine-scented air of 1994, simply because the insiders want it that way. The exact conversations held in that getaway car, the specific agonies that drove a 13-year-old to erase her own identity, and the precise mechanics of her 3-decade illusion will never be transcribed into an official police report. They belong exclusively to her, locked away in a psychological vault of her own choosing. The enduring legacy of Christina Marie Plante is not a cautionary tale about the physical dangers lurking in the woods, but a profound meditation on the extreme lengths of self-preservation. She taught the world that survival does not always mean fighting off an attacker. Sometimes, it means ruthlessly severing all ties and walking deliberately into the void. We often equate freedom with rescue, assuming that bringing a missing person home is the ultimate victory. But as the ink dries on this closed file, we are left with a haunting realization. For a desperate young girl staring down a life she could not bear, freedom was not about being saved by the authorities. True freedom, sometimes, is the sheer, unyielding determination to never be found.